Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Carbon Experts Live. We're so glad that you could join us today. This is One Click LCA's conversation series where we have conversations with smart people about important topics in sustainability. And today I'm very excited to announce our guest is Josefina Lindblom with the European Commission. So, Josefina, we're so glad to have you with us today.
Thank you.
And to introduce myself, my name is Aileen. I am a marketing expert with One Click LCA, and I'm joined as always by Travis Dahl, who is our business developer for One Click LCA, and he is also a carbon expert himself. Now, before we get started, I would love for you to go into the chat in whatever platform you're joining us by. If you're on LinkedIn or if you're on Livestorm, go ahead, jump into that chat and tell us where you are tuning in from. We have a global audience and we love to see where everyone is joining from. And while you are letting us know where you're coming from, I wanted to go over just a few little housekeeping rules, what to expect on this episode. So today we're going to start with covering the main questions with Josefina on what strategies she uses to promote whole life carbon reduction. So we'll find out some of the things that she's been working on with the European Commission and her thoughts on the field in general. We'll then have a live question and answer session. So that is a time for you, our live audience, to get your questions answered. So during the initial chat, if you have any questions, or during the live Q&A, if you think of a question you'd love to find out what Josefina thinks or you'd like to hear her answer, please put it into the chat. If you're joining us on LinkedIn Live, you can put your question into the comments section. If you're joining us on Livestorm, you can put it in the questions tab or the chat tab. We're monitoring all of those places, so we will collect all of your questions and ask Josefina during our live Q&A. And then we'll close, as always, by challenging Josefina to some questions of our own. So we have a list of questions prepared for her. Now, I can see that people are joining us from all over the world. We have folks coming in from Finland, some from London. We have some folks coming in from the United States. Some are joining us from India. So we really have a great global audience. Welcome. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. Now, as I said, our guest is Josefina Lindblom. She works with the European Commission as the Senior Policy Officer. And Travis, I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce our guest and get today's episode started.
Great. Thanks, Eileen. So welcome everybody to the 7th episode of Carbon Experts Live. This is One Click LCA's series of lively discussions with various different experts that are driving forward low carbon construction. If you've missed any of our past episodes, you can find these at youtube.com /at One Click LCA. And today our topic is the role of the built environment and Level's European Framework for Sustainability. And as Eileen mentioned, we've got Josefina Lindblom, who's Senior Policy Officer at the European Commission and is in charge of action for the Renovation Wave communication on a roadmap for the reduction of whole life carbon. They recently closed their public consultation for this work, and the intention is that that they're going to provide this roadmap early next year. So welcome, Josefina. Something that we always kick these conversations off with is a little bit of a personal question. We want to know a little bit about who you are, Josefina. What's your, what in your words, what is your story? How did you get started? And how did that bring you to your work today with the European Commission?
Thanks a lot for having me. It's really exciting to meet such a global audience. That's quite rare for me. So I'm a chemical engineer, and I have a PhD in chemical engineering design. So I have no academic background in buildings per se. But I've always been very interested in environmental policy. So once I had finished my PhD, I started working for the European Commission in a postdoc position, actually, and then I became a functionary, as it's called, a permanent staff. So I've been in different departments of the Commission in the last 24 years, always working in one way or the other on topics which are related to the industry and the environment, the interface there. In the last 12 years, I've been working on this file on sustainable buildings. That is at DG Environment, so it's kind of the Department for Environment at the European Commission. I work very closely with colleagues in other director generals as well. So we have for energy, we have for industry, and we have for climate action, for example. So we work very, very nicely and closely together. So that works very well. I've always worked to broaden the scope of what a sustainable building is. When I started this, as I said, about 12 years ago, it was very much seen as an energy efficient building equals a sustainable building. We knew it was much more than that, but a lot of people sort of stopped there, right? And we wanted to be able to incentivize and encourage really sustainable buildings, but we didn't have a common basis for what that would be, really. If we were asking experts, they would, I mean, as I said, most people would say, yeah, it's energy efficiency. Now, people who knew more, they would say, yeah, there are other things as well, but they would probably talk about different things. Or even if they talked about the same things, they would assess it and measure it differently. So it became very difficult for us to really drive this agenda more than just in general vague terms, which was not what we wanted to. So that's why we started to develop this common language, which we eventually are calling levels, which I know we will be talking more about in a while. So that sort of got us started. And while this file of mine, sustainable buildings in DG Environment, was very small in the beginning, it has become much bigger and much more relevant because with time, not only us, but also the sector itself and policymakers on national level and so on have understood that there is a lot to be done when it comes to sustainable buildings, and very importantly, how that also can have a direct impact on our climate targets, or rather how we achieve the climate targets, right? So now it is something which is receiving a lot of attention. So that's really nice. I think that's my little background.
Love that. Thanks for sharing all of that. And you touched on you did touch on levels and a couple of things that we want to that I'd like to cover today is both levels and some of the guidance towards policy. But I guess if we're going to start with levels, you mentioned that it's a common communication framework and I guess a guidance methodology for guidance. What I guess can you expand on it a little bit and maybe just define why it was developed and specifically maybe what was identified as missing when it comes to communicating about decarbonizing buildings and whole life carbon related to buildings?
Yeah, so we started with this work on levels back in 2015, and we published it in 2020. So it took us 5 years, right? Almost 6 years, actually. So we started it because, as I said before, we wanted to be able to incentivize and encourage sustainable buildings, or the production and so on of sustainable buildings, but we felt that we didn't have a common basis, common ground for what we were actually talking about. So we set out to develop this common language, and we did it together with several colleagues in the Commission, but more importantly, I would say, with lots and lots of stakeholders, building professionals of different kind, also policymakers on other levels than the European level, so national levels and local levels as well, across the EU. So it took a long time because we wanted to get it right. And we wanted it not just to cover the things that would be the most important ones, but also to do it in a way which would be useful for the market and for policymakers as well. So we took it step by step and really involved a lot of stakeholders who stayed with us, actually, surprisingly, for all those years, and gave us feedback throughout. And moreover, many of them took part in a 2-year test phase where they tested the beta version, you could say, of levels, so that we could be sure to really get it right for the final version. Now, levels is a framework with 16 indicators, which we are using to assess and report on sustainability performance of buildings. So we cover 6 different areas with those 6 indicators. The first 3 areas are more linked to the use of different kinds of resources. So energy, materials, and water. Those are the 3 first areas where we have a number of indicators, of which one, of course, is the whole life carbon indicator, right? And I think we would probably have stopped with those three areas, at least in DG environment, if it had been just sort of up to us. But we were quickly told by stakeholders that if we did that, it would only be a scheme interesting for environmental nerds such as ourselves. So they explained how we needed to add 3 other areas, which were more linked to the quality and the value of the building. So the 3 other areas are health and comfort, resilience to climate change, and life cycle costing and value. So those are the 6 areas where we have our 16 indicators. It's of course most certification schemes would have many more indicators than 16, right? But we wanted this, in this case, we wanted to have a common language which could be used by almost any kind of building project, so that we really tried to reduce the number of indicators and pick up those which we thought were the absolutely most important ones. It's important to understand that Levels is not a certification scheme, so we're not competing with those commercial schemes out there. It is really a methodology, a common language, as we say, which can be used by certification schemes. And by the way, we had many of those certification schemes active in Europe, being part of the development and the testing of Levels, and they are now aligning, many of them are aligning themselves with Levels. But we also, as I said, wanted it to be a tool which could guide any kind of building project interested in better understanding, if I take certain decisions at different times during my building project, what impact will that have on the sustainability performance of my building? So even if you're not certifying your building, even if you're not looking for a particular number value on the different indicators, you can still use it to sort of to play around with a bit and get a feeling for what you're doing. And then the third reason for doing it, of course, was also that, as I said in the beginning, we wanted to be able to incentivize sustainable buildings also in policy. So we are now using the Levels indicators since 2020 when we published it. We are using these indicators in different kinds of policy measures. So we use it as a basis to bring in, for example, circularity or life cycle thinking into policies. So I think that's the main background of Levels. Yeah.
That's great. And since you've had, seems like since you've already had a fair amount of collaboration from the industry players and stakeholders, I, I'm kind of, not to answer my own question, but what has the interest been from the industrial sector as far as uptake for this system as it's rolled out?
It was great actually from the beginning. I was kind of surprised how very enthusiastic people were throughout. In a sense, I understand it. I mean, if the Commission is developing something, they can look forward to, or they can fear that we're going to use it in policy eventually, right? But whatever, even regardless if they were looking forward to it or fearing it, they want to be sure to impact it while we're developing it. But no, it was really a good experience, and I must say that on many occasions throughout that process, but also afterwards, have I got to hear that it was really a good example of how the Commission can work together with stakeholders. The collaboration was really good. So I'm just very grateful for those large number of stakeholders participating very actively throughout. And as I said, also doing the testing for us, which was absolutely vital, I think, for us to get it right.
hmm And I know that this framework was predominantly developed with Europe in mind, but has
Mm.
there been, or are you aware of any uptake of this framework in other jurisdictions outside of Europe?
That I don't know, actually. I mean, we've been approached by some other parts of the world as well, just to understand levels better and to explain the background behind it and so on, because obviously these people were not organizations, were not part of developing levels. Um, but it's important to understand as well, perhaps, that as it is a common language, I am not aware of who is using it, right? If, of course, I know how we are using it in policy. I know how certification schemes are picking up those indicators. But I don't know if a random building project somewhere in Europe decides to work with the indicators, because it's voluntary. I mean, of course, policy may not be voluntary, but just picking up the indicators, you choose the indicators you want to work with from the scheme or from the framework, and you play around with it, so to say. But that we are not controlling in any way. We don't have a registry or something like that. So if you're asking me, okay, so how many are using it, I won't be able to say, actually.
hmm
And hence, I don't know either how much it is, if at all, played around with outside of Europe either. But I think now, and I guess we're going to come to that later on, as we're starting to really, or have started for some time now, to use the indicators as a basis for bringing in these aspects into policy. Even if levels per se as a framework is voluntary, it's sort of part of it. Part of those indicators are gradually becoming more and more important for building professionals to be aware of, because they're going to encounter them whether they want or not, so to say.
Totally. And something that we spoke about earlier before this call was just making sure that there's clarity around that the levels framework is a broader framework that includes aspects of circular economy or building circularity, but it's not necessarily framed around circularity. Would you be able to expand a little bit on how it does look at circularity?
Sure, yeah. As I said, we have 6 different areas. Remember, we had the energy, material, and water, and then we have the health and comfort, resilience to climate change, and life cycle costing and value. And as you can imagine, this area of materials, we actually call it resource efficient and circular material flows. So we have a couple of indicators in that area. We are looking at, well, first of all, we have the bill of materials, which is sort of making up one indicator, or the bill of quantities rather. And then we have an indicator which is about how a project is handling their waste, construction, demolition waste. And then we have one indicator for the design for adaptation and design for deconstruction. So those are the kind of areas that we are looking at more specifically, which we would sort of say sit under the circularity bit. Of course, we also have the whole life carbon indicator, which is very much, well, it's linked to many things, but circularity has a direct impact on that as well, of course. So it sort of sits there as well, I would say.
Yeah, and that's a really important piece that I wanted to touch on as well is the whole life carbon aspect. We've covered this, I think, quite a lot in this show and in internal conversations and various different people that we speak with. With when we model the carbon related to a building, there's often a whole lot of a whole lot of things that are being left out of the total assessment. Uh, how do you approach whole life carbon, and where do you think we should be setting the boundaries for a project?
Well, first of all, we are looking at the full life cycle of the building, right? So from the extraction of the materials until the end of life, and also what we are calling in Europe Module D. So that is how we are dealing with the recycled or reused materials. Eventually, what happens with the secondary material afterwards? So we consider really the whole cycle. to start with when we're looking at whole life carbon. We have not had any, until quite recently, we haven't had any policy in that area. We have policy which tackles part of the whole life carbon. Of course, we have quite strong legislation when it comes to the operational energy, so operational carbon. We also have strong legislation when it comes to how you produce the construction materials. So in particular, cement and metal, those energy intensive materials, which of course also have a direct impact on whole life carbon. But we haven't had policy which is sort of looking at whole life carbon of buildings, taking that focus, right? So I think we have missed the demand side of the material and of the energy in a sense at a building level. So that is what we are now trying to change. And we are doing that through different policy initiatives. We're taking perhaps small steps, but important steps, I think. And we are starting with actually requiring the reporting of whole life carbon of buildings. So that means that we are not playing around with limit values or targets yet in policy, but we are starting to require this reporting. And not just the reporting, but also the data collection, so that we eventually will have a better idea from real numbers, so to say, where we would probably have to, well, first of all, where we are now in terms of whole life carbon, different kinds of buildings in different parts of Europe, but also where we need to go then. We have a number of studies which are looking into this already, what the baseline is and what we could expect in different kinds of scenarios. But ultimately, it's very important to have the real numbers, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the direction we're going in. We have a piece of legislation which is being revised now, which will most likely then oblige product manufacturers to report on the global warming potential of their materials as well, which of course is necessary if we are going to be able to require the whole life carbon reporting at the building level. So we're sort of taking it step by step, but in general, it's really interesting work because the sector is to a large extent very interested and positive about it. And for a number of years now, when we've had different surveys for the building sector in Europe, what are the most important aspects they think in the coming years that they will have to deal with. This thing with whole life carbon comes up on top all the time. So I'm not saying that everybody is ready to do their life cycle analysis tomorrow, but they sort of realize that this is the next thing that is coming and they expect it to come and they think that it is important. So yeah, I think this is the way we're going. The question is how fast we can go.
That's always the hard part is we don't want to move quickly. So, and you touched on something that I think is really important. I've had this conversation a couple of times in the past, and what are your thoughts on the importance of modeling future scenarios for, like end of life scenarios with a building where, in 60, 50, 60, 70, maybe 100 years at the end of the life of a proposed building, we may not be recycling the materials in the way that it's particularly designed for, or maybe the policy isn't in place to make sure that that's actually happening. How would you approach that? What's your thought process around that?
Yeah, I agree totally. We can, of course, set ourselves scenarios and set indicators for what we hope is going to happen with the building or the materials that it's made up of in 50, 60, 70 years. Actually, quite a lot of the calculations that we do also, or let's say certain actions that we can model, they would not have an impact until after 50 years. And when we calculate the whole life carbon, we look at the first 50 years. So, but I think of course, we should consider and think a lot about what happens with the building after those 50, 60 years. It's not that we shouldn't care about it. It's extremely important, and it shows to some extent also the way we have chosen the indicators in levels. But we cannot think that that is enough, because we don't know what's going to happen later on, as you said. And moreover, we need to reduce our whole life carbon emissions now. So there are other ways in we can do that. Of course, we can work on the supply of the materials. We can work on the demand of the materials in the way we design our buildings, for example. But my big hobby horse lately is really the sufficiency aspect. So looking at how many new buildings are actually needed, because we know that a very large share of the built space in Europe, I mean a very large share, is underused in one way or the other. So it means that instead of building a new building of very nice low carbon materials, we actually shouldn't be building the new building at all in many cases. I'm not saying Europe is going to stop building. I'm just saying we need to consider in each case, do we actually need this building, or can we do with some of the buildings that we have, either not used at all or somehow underused. We know that the built space per person has increased a lot for a long time. And that, of course, has an impact both on the operational carbon and the embodied carbon. So I think it's really important to start to consider this aspect of sufficiency as well. Obviously, we're not trying to squeeze in people in smaller homes, people who are already living in the right size of homes, if there's any right size. But we just know that there is a lot of space which is not used to its full extent. So the question is, how can we do that better? So I think that's a really important aspect. I was yesterday talking to at quite a big event here in Brussels, which the cement industry was organizing. And there was a lot of interest in this sufficiency aspect, or perhaps better called right sizing. Yeah. I hope, and I think that it can be sort of the next key concept that we look into. To a large extent, that would have to be on a not at the EU level, but at national or even local level, right? But I do think that is a key way of reducing our whole life carbon emissions quickly. Because we know, of course, if we look at the profile of carbon emissions coming from a new building, we know that the upfront embodied carbon, so this the carbon emissions which are related to the extraction of the materials and the manufacturing of construction products, and also the construction itself to some extent. So before we have even started to use the building, we have the biggest peak during the whole lifetime of the building. It's an enormous amount of carbon being released during that process. So if we can avoid having a lot of new buildings and instead looking at how to use the buildings that we have in a better way, in terms of change of behavior, but also, of course, renovating or refurbishing the existing buildings, which are not for some reason attractive today, and using the space better, really. I think that's probably, it's probably not easy politically, but I think it's probably the easiest way to reduce whole life carbon.
It's funny you say that. Both Eileen and I are from Canada and the U.S. and the right size of building for an individual is that's an interesting concept that might it's largely based on perspective, and that might be something that's a little bit more challenging to push through at a policy level, just due to some of the politics around it. So, but I think that's a really interesting concept. I've heard this idea around, like bike shares and car shares and things like that. Does it make sense to have a car sitting in a parking lot for 95% of its existence? Why not, especially now that we have self-driving technology, getting these vehicles moving around on a regular basis so that less vehicles are needed that are just sitting parked. And bringing that same concept to the built environment. I'd be really interested to see some of the solutions around how we can kind of either create shared spaces that 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 serve as both, you know, workspaces and living spaces and, you know, commercial spaces, what have you.
Yeah,
And
it's not
I'm just not sure how that would be delivered.
it's not. I'm not saying it's obvious at all. We are making a small study now just to look at different cases around Europe where these concepts have been looked at and used, just to see how it's been functioning and what people think about it. I think perhaps the first reaction that you could get if you talk about sufficiency is like people push back, right? Because what? I want my space, kind of. And we all do. I'm not saying that, but I think there is a lot of opportunities for more shared space. First of all, I think it's uh, a lot of households we have single people living in my country, in Sweden, where I come from. If I'm not mistaken, it's, yeah. Well, in any case, it's a very high share of all the households which are one person households. I'm not saying that you always want to hang out with your with your neighbors, but I think there are ways of going about that could be interesting. It could suit some people at least, you know. And also, of course, the standard thing with how can you use certain buildings for a bigger part of the time in a week or a day. Let's say a lot of the buildings that we have are only used for a limited time. The standard example is, of course, can you use schools for something else in the evenings or in the weekends when they are otherwise empty? But there are other examples as well, of course. And then we have the the consideration of, it's many of us who have managed to many years ago, if we are old enough, we have a home, and we may even have paid off our mortgage, and now our household is smaller than what it was when we initially bought the home, but we're still sitting in the same home, right? Because it's just easy, and it sort of ends up like that. But I don't need, personally, the home that I'm living in, it used to be for 3 people. Well, now it is for one, and I don't need 3 times more space. I wasn't crowded when we were 3 people, for sure. But for different reasons, I'm just staying, and I think I'm not the only one in that sense. So I think there are many things to consider.
Hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting way to think about it. Um, and coming back to the levels framework, how would you say that this has driven some of the policies that, or are you able to speak on some of the policy development that has taken place or may be underway in regards to reference to levels?
Yeah, we have a range of different policies in Europe, of course. Um, I think the very first one where we managed to use the levels indicators is in a piece of policy which is very broad, which covers loads of different sectors, but buildings is one of them. And it's called the Initiative of Sustainable Finance. So the Commission has actually, for lots of sectors, set out different kind of criteria or indicators, you could say, that an investment would need to fulfill in order to be defined as a sustainable investment. And with that comes certain possibilities then, if you do that, right? So there we have started to use the levels indicators, in particular the whole life carbon one, but also the circularity indicators that I talked about before. So that has worked really well. And I think because we were able to put it into that piece of policy, which is voluntary, I should say, because not all investments may necessarily choose to be considered as sustainable. But because we were able to do it there and it worked well, we have also now, we are using, in particular, the whole life carbon indicator from levels in different kinds of building policies, which are previously were only concerned with the operational energy, or I shouldn't say only because it's a very important part, but we have been able to expand a couple of building specific and also obligatory mandatory pieces of legislation, adding this whole life carbon aspect or concept to it through the help of levels. So that has been really, really useful. I'm not saying that we wouldn't have been able to do anything if we hadn't had levels, but I think it has really made it easier for us to go about.
And you when we spoke earlier prior to this call, you also mentioned a program called Fit for 55, the Fit for 55 policy. Can you explain that a little bit? And is this a retirement program, or what is this?
I was going to say that's me actually. I'm turning 56 later this week, so I'm still I'm still kind of
Congratulations.
fit for 55. No, but it has to do with in end of 2019 when we had this existing European Commission entering, we have new commissioners coming in every 5 years. And with the one that we have now, which came in end of 2019, they launched the European Green Deal, which you may have heard of. And sitting under that as well, there are many things which are sitting under that. But we are of course setting out the climate neutrality targets. We should be neutral by 2050. And so a number of years ago, I don't remember when now, it was decided, it was a political decision that we would reduce our emissions by 40% by 2030. However, a few years ago, that was changed. We realized that we have to go down to 55% by 2030 to be able to reach our climate neutrality targets by 2050. So of course, in relation to that Fit for 55 is what we call it. So our different policies need to be fit to make sure that we actually reach our minus 55% targets by 2030. There are also a number of policies which are relating to buildings, of course, because buildings are such a big, or the sector is such a big emitter of carbon. So the different pieces of legislation, which are the most important ones for buildings, they sit under that Fit for 55 umbrella, you could say. Levels is of course not a piece of legislation. It's this common language that I'm going on about, but we are able to use it then to support those different kinds of policies which are sitting under the Fit for 55 umbrella.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that, as I was scanning through the levels documentation, something that came up was carbon leakage and the some of the challenges around having manufacturing that's done within Europe that meet the requirements, but a lot of larger companies or larger organizations, for them it might make financial sense to have their carbon intensive manufacturing done where the policies are a little bit looser and bring those products in and or import products from other companies that are operating in jurisdictions that have looser policy and bringing these things in.
Yeah, you're right.
How do we address this?
Yeah, you're right. But we have it's not my area of expertise, but we have, of course, also legislation now which looks at the at precisely that we cannot. There's kind of a carbon tax, you could say, for material that is being taken in, which is imported into Europe. So I cannot go into detail in that, but for sure that is something which is looked at very carefully, not just for the building sector, but in general when we are importing material from other parts of the world.
This has been a really fascinating conversation. Of course, listening to you talk about the challenges that lie ahead, but then the tools that you and others are developing to meet those challenges head on. It's very inspirational, and but we have quite a few questions from our live audience. So I did want to jump in and ask some of those questions on our audience's behalf. So the first question we have here, it's on the screen. Which European certification schemes are looking into aligning with the levels framework for specific credit compliance?
Yeah, I'm not able to talk about all of them because I wouldn't simply know. But I think one of the bigger ones, which have been very much driving this, is the German DGNB. So there I am certain of what I'm saying. But I think, well, I know there are others as well, but of slightly smaller size as well. But that's a really big one in Europe, and they are working in different countries. So the DGNB, I would say, is probably the most important important one in this case.
And is there any, can you elaborate a little on who should be looking at that certification scheme, or who that would most likely affect?
Well, the certification schemes, they are voluntary and commercial. So it's really what we see in Europe is that they are primarily, large, high-end building projects which are going through certification. I assume it's the same in most countries, also outside of the EU. So with the certification schemes, you're not really reaching the general building project, and that is why we develop levels so that it would be useful to work with also for almost any kind of building project, right? But if you are certifying your building through some of the more common certification schemes in Europe, not all, but many, you are likely to sort of, even though you don't understand it or you don't realize, you are likely to bump into some of the levels indicators because they are there behind the credits of the different certification schemes then.
So far-reaching effect, even for those who don't realize that they're
Yeah.
being affected by it.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
Our next question from our live audience comes from Mariana, and she asks, how do you ensure localization of these 16 indicators in very different contexts around Europe? You did talk a little bit about how we need to measure what's happening in different areas of Europe. So how do you ensure that localization?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Do you mean how do we ensure that these 16 indicators are relevant in different parts of Europe? Is that what you mean?
I think the question is probably addressing that, and then also as well making sure that the results are localized. It's probably different indicators
All right.
matter. They weigh
Okay.
differently in different regions.
Yeah, I see. So first of all, then, just to be very clear that which can be surprising to some people when they hear it the first time, Level sets out a method of how to assess or measure, but it doesn't set any benchmarks. It doesn't say for each indicator, it doesn't have sort of numbers of what you're supposed to reach. There's no such thing as levels plus or levels gold or levels A or something like that. That we leave to those who are using levels. So if you are using it in a certification scheme, it's up to them to say what do they think is suitable for that market where they are operating. If it is in policy, we have, for example, it's not only in EU policy where we have uh, levels indicators used as a basis for bringing these aspects in. We also see it in some national policies where they pick up in particular the whole life carbon levels indicator and use that as a basis for them in their national policy or legislation. And then it is, of course, up to them to set that number that they think that different projects should reach. And then the third way of working with the levels indicators or the use of the levels indicator is then if you as a individual building project, you decide to work with some of the levels indicators. And if you do it like that, and it's sort of a one case thing that you do it or a one time, then it's true, you don't have anything to compare with. You don't know what your okay, so I've done this now, but was that good or not? Well, I would say it was good that you did it. And then when you do it the second time with a similar kind of project, then you can start comparing. Or you can even, on your first project, you could compare depending on if I do this now or if I do that instead. You could sort of calculate or assess at least what is the result depending on the decisions that I take eventually. So yeah, um, it was actually something which was made very clear from the beginning from all those building professionals that joined us already back in 2015, that they wanted us to develop a method, this common language, but they did not want us to start setting benchmarks, but that must be done on a national or even local level. So we haven't gone into that.
That makes sense. So you rely on the local certification scheme that you're going for to get those sort of the more local what you should reach for each of the indicators levels is more telling you what to measure, and then what the
Yeah.
result should be is determined by the certification scheme or maybe a local
Yeah,
policy.
certification scheme. Yeah, a local policy, perhaps public procurement, local public procurement as well, things like that. They pick up the levels indicators, but they set the sort of the benchmarks themselves. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, and then we have a question from Jack, which is, how does Levels consider use of secondary materials like recycled, reused, and other consumer or industry wastes? So not quite reusing the sufficiency way that you were speaking of before, but in line with that thought of reusing what we already have.
Yeah, we have, as I mentioned before, we have 4 levels indicators under this material area. And one of them is indeed looking at the waste you're generating and what you do with your waste. So reuse, recycle. So there is an indicator which considers those aspects, looking at the construction and the demolition waste. We are not, the levels per se is not looking at the waste on the sites where you're producing the material or the products. That's something else, right? And perhaps that is what I understand with industry waste. So we're not looking at that. We're looking at the construction demolition waste. Neither are we looking at consumer waste or the municipal waste. So how do you living in a building, what do you do with your waste, kind of? That is not part of levels. So we're strictly looking at the construction and the demolition waste.
Excellent. And then I think we have another question from our audience, which is, you mentioned that manufacturer specific EPD data will become mandatory. So what do you think is the biggest challenge to getting this data, and how can we overcome those challenges?
Yeah, that's a very good question. First of all, this is being negotiated now between different legislators in the EU. So it is not, I cannot be sure that it will become mandatory, but it looks good the way I look at it. I don't think if that happens that it will be the full EPD data with the full life cycle analysis with all the different impact categories. But it is more likely then, if it happens, that it will be on the global warming potential, that impact category specifically. I must confess that it is a different department of the Commission which is working on this. So I don't know if there are any particular exemptions from certain companies that wouldn't have to do it. I cannot say that, I'm afraid. But we, of course, know that there are certain countries already which are using are requiring whole life carbon reporting on the building level, although they don't have all the information yet from all the different materials. So then they are working with generic data. But as we will gradually start requiring this kind of information from the product manufacturers, this will change. I understand I'm not answering the question specifically, but I don't know exactly how my colleagues who are working on it's called the construction product regulation, where this is now being discussed, those aspects, how they are looking at different timelines for different kinds of companies and so on. But I think an important, in order to be able to cover everyone, I personally think that it would be important for associations, whether national or European associations, which are sort of uh, having different product manufacturers as their members, to support and perhaps, again, now I'm sort of brainstorming with myself, so I don't know if I'm saying something which is following the lines of this legislation as it is being negotiated, but it could also be that you're starting with having some average values for your different products, as opposed to have very specific LCAs for each and every product that you're manufacturing. I think there are different ways of sort of gradually phasing this in. But yeah, I think that is as far as I can go on that question.
I guess we could probably have a whole Carbon Experts Live episode on this topic and expand that some more. Well, we have a few of our questions for you. So this is a little more general. We like to ask all of our guests, if you had the power to change any one thing in the industry, what would it be?
I make it easy for myself then and say that it would be to have all building projects assess and report on their whole life carbon and start working towards targets that we are setting ourselves, which would gradually have to go down then to meet our climate targets.
That is a shared goal that we have here at One Click LCA, so we are fully on board with that. And then a question from last month's guest, Amy Leadham, she's with Atelier 10. She asked, what do you see as the biggest opportunity from implementing circular economy principles to reduce the carbon emissions of building products?
Yeah, I would actually, if I'm allowed to, slightly change the question.
Absolutely.
And say that I wouldn't, I choose not to read it as, taking out a product from a building, considering it as a secondary product, and then see what I can do with it. I would rather come back to this aspect of sufficiency that I talked about. I see that more as circularity, not of the building products, but of the building itself. So I think the biggest opportunity from implementing circular economy principles is to make sure that we reuse buildings that are currently not used.
Fantastic. So instead of looking at it from the individual product level, just reuse the whole thing. That makes it easy. Well, our next guest is going to be Jeremy Field. He's Senior Sustainability Advisor at Introba. And we want to ask you to challenge him for next month. So what question do you want us to challenge him with?
Yeah, it actually follows the same topic. So sorry if you think I'm a bit snowed under. But I would like to ask him how he believes that organizations like the one he's working at can work on repurposing unused or underused buildings and make them attractive, as opposed to construct new buildings.
I think he will have a lot of fun answering that question. So that is great. And now we have a quick question for our live audience. So we've had a lot of people joining us today. We've talked a lot about the Levels European Framework. Josefina has given us a lot of information about it. But if you would like help understanding levels and finding out how you can use the European framework in your project so that you can have levels compliant results, we have a poll in our Livestorm audience. So if you're joining us from Livestorm, the poll is going to pop up in a minute, and we're going to ask, would you like a free consultation to learn about how one-click LCA tools can help you with levels compliant results? So if you would like that free consultation, you'd like to learn more about levels and how you can use one-click LCA to achieve those levels compliant results, click yes on the live poll that's on your screen. And if you are not joining us from Livestorm, you can visit the link that is showing on the screen. We're also going to put it into the chat to learn more about levels and how you can use one-click LCA. You can also book a demo right from that page. So we have tools, and we want to help spread the word and promote this framework and this levels tool so that more and more people can use it. And that wraps up our episode today. We're really glad that you could join us. There were a lot more questions in the live chat than we could answer today. So stay tuned for ways you can get your questions answered. but a few resources that we have that I'd like to share with you, the audience. We have embodied carbon policy resources at oneclicklca.com/library. So that's an easy place for you to go and access a lot of resources on embodied carbon. And then we also have our Eco Design in Practice series, which you can see at oneclicklca.com/ecodesign. We have some other articles that are also going to be useful. So if you want to learn more about sustainability in the built environment, head over to our website and check those out. And then lastly, we have free training and resources at our online academy. We have a registration is now open for the boot camps, which are coming up in November. That's our Construction LCA boot camp. So we encourage you to go in and register and join us for that in November. And then if you'd like to keep the conversation going, if you have more questions you want to ask, we have the contact information for both Josefina and Travis here, as well as One Click LCA's main contact page. So if you have more questions you'd like to ask, please don't hesitate to reach out. I know that both Travis and Josefina are just absolutely a wealth of knowledge in the industry. So they are a great resource. And then just to remind you guys, next time is going to be, our next episode will be on November 15th at 4 p.m. Central European Time, 10 a.m. Eastern Time. And that will be with Jeremy Field, Senior Sustainability Advisor at Introba. So put it in your calendar and make sure that you join us next time. Josefina, once again, I want to say thank you so much for joining us today. Travis, thank you as always for hosting a wonderful conversation. And I'll pass it back to you to wrap us on up.
Thank you, Aileen. Yeah, just very last thing, something that we always put a request out for. We'd love to get your feedback for anybody that is listening in, whether you're listening live or through one of our recordings on YouTube or elsewhere. Please send us some guests of anybody that you might like to hear from. Somebody like Josefina, or somebody that's a practitioner in the industry, policymakers, and so on. We'd love to get your thoughts of anybody that we may not be aware of that we may want to hear from. So let us know. You can email us at hello@oneclicklca.com. And that's it for today. I think we can sign off here, and we'll see you all next month.
Can I say something?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, sorry, Josefina, go
Can I
ahead.
just well, first of all, thanking you, of course, for having me. It was great fun. I really enjoyed it. But also to the people who have been listening, if you're interested in levels, can I just suggest that you Google levels sustainable buildings, European Commission, perhaps if you're googling from far away to find us more easily. There you will find a lot of information, and you will also find the link to our levels LinkedIn group, where we post a lot of good stuff, I think. So Google levels sustainable buildings. If you only Google levels, I think you will come to the song of another Swedish person, Avicii. So you have to add sustainable buildings and European Commission as well. Thank you.
Okay, I'll be joining that LinkedIn group right away.
Thanks.
Thanks, Josefina.